Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm very happy to be with Adam Tzur. I actually don't think I pronounced that last name right, so I'm going to get you to actually pronounce your name, Adam. How do you pronounce that?
Yeah, it's Tzur. It's
Tzur.
almost
Okay,
like Sir, but with a T
got you.
in front. But I just looking at my name, it's not very intuitive how you're supposed to pronounce it.
It's all the European names. We're joking off air about how I'm awful at pronouncing names. Like British people, I think, are notorious for just being like, why don't you just speak English? Come on, guys. So anyway, to introduce Adam, he is from Sci-Fit. He launched that in 2016, and he owns that, and is still publishing kind of articles which are all based around kind of study collections around fitness and nutrition. So you may have actually stumbled across his website. I was just telling Adam that I used to kind of stumble across it now and then and dig into articles. And when I was like in that, I guess, your early evidence-based career where you're like trying to read everything and digest everything there is. And then I recently stumbled across it and a really cool article that we're going to be talking a bit more about. And I really like this podcast. Partly it's great it's at a size where I can maybe bring a person's face to an audience who haven't seen it yet. And I think that might be the case for Adam. And I think he's definitely a person a lot of you, if you're not already following his work and following him, definitely want to be. And I know you've got some future kind of projects in the line for Sci-Fit as well. And I know it was partly inspired by Greg Nuckols from his original Strength Theory and now Stronger by Science. And you can definitely see that. And if people know what kind of the work Greg produces, it's very, very similar and very much in depth, which is awesome. I don't know if, Adam, you want to go a bit more about your background, who you are, and also I know you have a really cool kind of message on your website where you go over kind of your philosophy and approach. And I think the audience will really appreciate hearing that.
Sure. I just had a comment first when you said that British people, mispronounce things. You really make up with it with your awesome accent. So, there's no worries about that. And in terms of like the website, it started in 2016. It was basically, like you said, inspired by by Strength Theory, as it was known at that time. And actually, it was Greg who picked me up on Reddit, because I wrote some sort of research summary, and he actually asked me to write an article for his website. So Greg is actually the inspiration for Sci-Fit, and we've worked together previously on articles and stuff. So I would definitely, I just, Stronger by Science now is one of the best, I would say the best sites on evidence-based fitness. But yeah, about Sci-Fit, it was basically a reaction to that I was reading so many articles. I was learning about fitness. I read so many conflicting articles on different websites, on different bodybuilding websites, and everyone had their own advice depending on what the author was, and the advice was conflicting. So I was like, okay, we need some sort of way to figure out is there any sort of objective truth here? So, the evidence-based fitness sphere, I think, has been very inviting, because here you can actually start. You can use anecdotal evidence like opinions, but you have the primary foundation for your beliefs is in the empirical evidence from research, and then you adapt it based on your opinions and personal experiences.
And I know within your philosophy there, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, there was you had kind of a section where you talked about kind of why you like to rely on studies more than anecdote, and you had kind of a few bullet points. I think the audience would appreciate that, because I think a lot of them are like, don't rely on anecdote, that's a weak form of evidence, but I don't know if they necessarily understand exactly why that wouldn't be the way to go.
Yeah, oftentimes anecdotes and scientific evidence are sort of like put up versus one another. And I also do it as well in some sense, because, you'll often hear arguments, or especially online, people will say, well, this coach said that you should train 2 times every day, and he has trained many world athletes. Therefore, I will do that. Or some friend has an experience. I've looked at my friend. He trains once every year, and he's huge, right? So and then people there, you'll draw conclusions based on that. But the problem with these individual observations or your personal experiences is that they're very limited. So research by definition is looking at large groups of people, and they like figure out on average what works, right? So if you're trying out to figure out how often you should train, or if you should take a protein supplement or whatever it is, it's better to start by figuring out what works for most people on average, right? And then you can individualize it. But if you start with individualization by looking at one data point, basically what one coach says or what your experience is, then it's very narrow, and you can't generalize it to a larger, to a general principle based on your personal experience.
Yeah, and I know one of the points you mentioned, or at least it was like I guess this is the term. It's like survivorship bias.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear kind of how that might relate to different diets, training programs, that sort of thing.
Yeah, this is the perfect example of in terms of like maybe bodybuilding competitors. Like, so survivorship bias deals with when you look at let's say you look at the top 10 bodybuilders today, and you're like, okay, I want to learn what made them go to the top. And then you go and copy their routine. You assume that whatever you can see is what got them there, but maybe it's something that you didn't see that got them there. For example, let's say 100 bodybuilders, they don't do squats, right? And one of them becomes pro. And the one who becomes pro, you look at him and you look at his program, and it's like, oh, wait, this guy, he doesn't squat. So therefore, I shouldn't squat if I want to become pro. But then you don't look at the 99 other bodybuilders who also tried to become pro and didn't squat, but it failed for most of them. But you can't see them because they didn't survive the process. Therefore, survivorship bias. So that this applies to absolutely everything. Whenever you look at a lead of people and you're trying to look at their program or diet or nutrition, you don't know if you're looking at the survivorship bias. Maybe what they're doing isn't the reason they got there. Maybe it's something as simple as genetics, which could be one thing you can't see.
Yeah, I think when people hear that as well, at least I know where I've tried, like, I'm pretty sure I've tried, like, I don't know, Phil Heath's program out of Flex magazine or something, and I've done these things, and like you see all these people who have done it, and apparently it's like worked for them, or a diet, for example. I've tried loads of different diets, and I was like, you feel like you're the problem, but you're just like potentially picking on, like, a lot of the time it's not individualizing it to you and kind of looking at, I guess, the scientific principles or the mechanisms behind it, and you're just hoping that, oh, because this guy did it, it should work for me. And I guess it's horrible. I know a lot of personal trainers rely on that methodology in terms of like, this is what's worked for me, I'm going to apply it to my clients. All my clients, they should be able to do this. Otherwise, they're too weak to survive it in some ways. They're the problem, not what I'm doing. Whereas, like, that's where science can really be helpful, because you can truly individualize. You can start understanding the person as an individual.
Yeah, so that's a very important point there, that even though you can look at scientific principles and base your training around that, you can still individualize and use anecdotes. It's just that you use them. The general recommendation is to start with the average, see what works on average, and then you use your personal experience to see how you respond to whatever program or whatever thing you're trying to do. But always start with what should work in a scientific sense. But we'll probably get into this later, but there's a lot of, even in the scientific average, there's a lot of, an average can consist, like an average of 50 can consist of zeros and hundreds, right? So some people respond well to a program and some people respond poorly to a program, even though the average is good.
Yeah, I think that's why I wanted to start off our discussion in terms of, obviously, you really appreciate the science, and that is something that you think you really value, and I think we all value as kind of evidence-based practitioners or people who use the evidence to our advantage. But it does have limitations, and anecdote is also part of evidence-based practice. It's just not necessarily, it's not where you start, right? Where you start is with the science, but there's still even problems then with science. And that's why it doesn't give you the answer. You can't kind of have this research paper and be like, oh yeah, that means it's going to work exactly for me, exactly how it worked for those people in that study. Because like I read through, and this is what drew me to Adam, was because he has this article on his website, which I will definitely link below, which was essentially talking about the limitations of studies. I think it's really important for this podcast to talk about that, because we talk about studies all the time, but we don't necessarily always talk about the limitations. And even if people coming on are aware of the limitations, they might not think to kind of embellish upon that, or maybe they're not looking at a study because they see all the limitations. But I think it's important to at least go through some of them. And in the article, there's a lot, there's a lot of limitations to science. But I don't know if you want to start, if there's one that really, really kind of, I don't know if you have a priority that you like, or if there's any that you particularly like talking about. Otherwise, I can kind of throw one of them at you.
Yeah, I think it would be better if you just told me what you want to talk about, because like the article, the background for the article was that I noticed there was various limitations in research, and then I started to just basically make a list, and the list grew and grew, and then I figured, oh, there's so many potential limitations, and I eventually accepted that every article will have limitations, and we shouldn't reject an article simply based on its limitations, but it's important to know what the limitations are. So just start in whichever end you feel is the most productive.
Yeah, for sure. And this is the reason I love this is because it's like that middle ground that we edge for, because people will think of like PubMed warriors. Are they kind of like religious to the science or whatever? They think they're being scientific in that way. But then you have like the bros who are like, no, there's like, I don't know, the limitations, and they know some of them and they're right with some of them, but they just poo-poo every single scientific study, which again, is not the best place to be. So somewhere in that gray area in the middle is where kind of you're coming from, and where we're trying to come with evidence-based fitness. But one of the ones I'd love to talk about, because I think it's very important for a lot of them, is the kind of the duration of a study, and that why that inherently will cause limitations.
This is a big one. Yeah, that's a really big one. That's a good choice, because there are so many studies today, fitness studies particularly, that are like 4 weeks, 5 weeks, And the issue there is that, there's a reason they're so short, is that, first of all, studies are really expensive, and running studies over time is really expensive. And also, people don't want to be in a study that lasts for a year. You don't like, let's say, Steve, if I told you, okay, so let's say you have a good program. Okay, never mind. You're not going to do that. You're going to be randomized into a study where you get either the good program or the the bad control program. Okay, so now you're randomized into the bad control program for a year, and you're going to do that for a year. Would you give up a year of your training just for some scientific principle?
Absolutely, no doubt. No,
I don't think I would do so
there's
myself.
No way.
I don't
couldn't
think
do it.
Most of us wouldn't, and that's the reason. That's the reason why studies are one of the reasons why studies are so short, is that people don't want to give up their, especially we want trained participants, we want trained people into the studies for a year, and they should give up their program to do some other program or some other diet that might not work because it's experimental, or just a boring controlled diet. So yeah, there's a reason studies are short. But the problem is that, I think hypertrophy measured in CSA, for example, the cross-sectional area of the muscle, I think it's like a minimum of 3-4 weeks that's like the point where you need the minimal amount of time you need to detect statistically significant changes in muscle cross-sectional area. So
you said 2 months in the article. I don't know if it sounds close.
If it was 2 months in the article, then it was probably wrong, because I've seen studies. I wrote that in 2017, I think.
Yeah.
But I've seen studies later that have said 3 or 4 weeks.
Okay.
But it depends on what you're measuring. Like if you're measuring like lean body mass, I think it takes longer. But if you're measuring cross-sectional area, then it's shorter. So I guess it depends on what you're measuring. If you're measuring muscle protein synthesis, then it's like, days or even hours, depending on how you want to look at it. But it depends on how you want to measure it. But anyways, 4 or 5 weeks isn't really enough to, you know, because you want to try to figure out, does this program or does this diet work or does this technique work? You can't, if you want to figure this out, if it will work in the long term, then you need a long-term study. But like I said, it's expensive. It's unlikely that people will do these studies.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I don't know, just inherently, I'm thinking, how much muscle am I gaining, like as a trained individual in 4 to 5 weeks? I mean, I pray that I've gained some muscle. So it's certainly not going to be like something I just doubt it's going to be particularly detectable. It's so like gaining phases that for trained lifters are extended for exactly that reason. Things are so slow. So I can see why in literature it can be so hard. And I know you said in the article as well, like a lot of the periodization literature kind of suggests that there's no difference. And we actually, I think that will come as no surprise to the listeners. Like a lot of kind of the evidence-based folks will say, like, that's what the literature says, but in practice, when they coach as well, it seems to make a difference. But I mean, periodization is long term, and the studies, unfortunately, can't necessarily always be that long, can they? Like you just said.
Yeah. You can't do like periodization. I mean, that could go on. That could go for like, I don't know how long your cycles are, but I've heard of like long cycles, like half a year, or, you know. So if the study is like 6 weeks, then it can't inform you about what will happen in a year or two.
Yeah.
So that's a big issue, and it also means that sometimes when you don't detect differences, like you say, there could be a difference. It's just hiding behind 10 more years of training, or 10 more weeks of training, not years.
Yeah.
But like it could be detected, but it needs more time. So that's another problem.
Yeah, it's always kind of, when you look at a study, you're like, oh, I just wish they kept measuring that for a little bit longer just to see kind of what might have happened. And then you start like spitballing and guessing what maybe could have been, but then like you can't do that. So no, that's a great one. And another one, actually, I guess it kind of leads into the duration a little bit, is the number of participants, and how that can create a problem. I know with like statistical power, I thought that was really well described in the article that I don't think people will maybe appreciate.
Yeah, so I hope this. I hope whenever I talk about statistics, I can just see the eyes of people gloss over. So I'll try to just keep everything about statistics brief, because I think there's like a small minority of stats people who are like, yes, let's talk about statistics. And then there's like 99.9% of people who are like, oh my God, this is so boring. So in terms of like the statistical power is basically, does the study have the possibility to detect whatever it's looking for? Right. So if you're looking for a difference, let's say you're doing training program A and training program versus training program B. You want to see if training program B is better. But if you have 3 participants, you need a huge effect. Like you need a huge difference to be able to detect the difference. But if you have 200 participants, you can detect a difference, even if it's much smaller. This is what statistical power is that it's affected by many things, but the number of participants in the study is a big one. And it's easier to statistically detect differences between people. You're more sure of your conclusions if you have more people in the study. But again, it's expensive, it's hard to get people, and people don't want to do another training program for a long time. So this is why you have small sample studies.
Yeah, I think it's not uncommon to see, like, I mean, you're not going to get 100 plus people. No. We're talking about tens of people. And yeah, when you really well described that, where you might be looking at a study, it might say there's no difference, but I mean, if there's only a handful of people, it's so difficult for it to have, like you said, it would have to be night and day difference to have actually shown that. Yeah. So again, people might jump on the abstract, or they might not understand that kind of statistical power. And then they might say, oh, yeah, clearly then there's no difference. And it's kind of like, well, the study isn't like a strong statement for that, because it just wasn't well powered in that sense. And I've heard that kind of been said. And I just think maybe now the listeners will go, oh, that makes sense. So I think you explained that really well. Then I guess another one, sorry, go on.
I just wanted to say thanks.
Oh, oh awesome. So yeah, another one, I guess, in talking about kind of the number of people is also the people, and particularly like gender, and you kind of talked about age and the type of person that's often within studies.
Yes. So another issue with, as you can detect the theme here, is that it's hard to recruit people. So one thing that happens is that scientists do convenience sampling. And that's why convenience sampling is when you select people, you ask people that are nearby, that are easy to get. So, for example, that's why you have so many studies about fitness and nutrition with men in college in their 20s. It's because those are the subjects that are easy to get and that are willing to participate in the study, right? So you have a ton of studies on males in college in the 20s, but you don't have a lot of studies in, like, you don't have a lot of hypertrophy studies in women or in older people. You do have some in older people because of sarcopenia, the muscle loss. So for that reason, scientists want to keep old people active for longer. So they recruit some older people too, but they won't do some modern training program. They'll just do like, does resistance training work or doesn't it work? Like simpler studies. But there are some periodization studies, but it's mostly in younger people, and frequency studies and stuff like that. So I kind of forgot what was the question again.
I think you pretty much covered it. Where like it's that opportunity, who's available, who's willing, and it's often males in their 20s, which will be a lot of the listeners, but they're also obviously also a lot of the time not particularly trained.
Not trained either,
That's actually something I thought was really interesting that you pointed out, was sometimes, I don't know how often it's just one of those you can't be sure of, but often the scientists will rely on the person being like, yeah, I'm trained. Like, I've been lifting like 5 years.
I mean, you have to trust, like, in studies, I believe most studies, they will just ask the participants how long they've trained. And then they're like, oh, I've trained for 5 years. But like, yeah, but have you trained on and off for 5 years? Was 5 years the first time you started? Or have you been actively training 2 times a week for 5 years? And what's your one rep max in the bench and the squat and stuff like that? A lot of studies, they're good. They're actually testing, they're doing a baseline test of how strong you are. But you can also see, like, there's a discrepancy. And like, they say they've been training for 10 years, but the data of their one rep max shows that you are not as strong as we suspect you should have been if you were trained. So yeah, there are limitations there as well. So
hey, Pascal here. I just wanted to take the moment to talk about our membership site. Inside, you'll find a thriving forum, an extensive exercise library, courses, presentations, and research reviews. All I need you to do is hit the link in the description below and sign up.
Yeah, I think that I've seen studies, probably more recent ones, where they have tested, which I think is so important, because if they just ask like, what's your like 1 rep max in the big 3 or something, and the person's just like, I don't know, especially young males in their 20s, they probably want to sound kind of like stronger and bigger than they are, so they probably do embellish some of these things. So I guess that's something at least some of the studies, they are trying to kind of prevent that sort of thing coming into it too much. I guess one of the other points to move on to is kind of the adherence part of it. I know you talked about that in terms of like, they're in this study and they've got like coaches with them, and how that could impact actually real world versus within a study, and the difference there.
Wait, so can you formulate that question a bit differently, like how it's in the real world versus the study world?
Yeah, I think I guess one of the examples I would think of is like, people talk about training to failure studies and things, and like in some of them, they're like, I don't know, not holding a literal gun to someone's head, but they're screaming and shouting like 1 more rep. Or in other ones, they will be like, they don't want to cause harm to the participants, when the participants like, I'm done, even though maybe they're not truly like actually at that kind of objective fatigue point. And then in the real world, how are you at pushing yourself relative to that? And I guess there's other kind of implications there, like, are you actually getting your ass to the gym, or are you actually like doing the same range of motion this person's doing in the gym, like in the study, versus out?
Yes, very good point. So in studies, they try to control as much as possible. They control the humidity, the room temperature, or at least good studies. They're like control as many factors as they can. They put people in special environments that are like with a coach who's like you say, who's shouting at you, who's trying to, if you're training to failure, he's making sure you're going to failure. And then you may get certain results in that study. But if people try to do this in the real world by themselves, you're in a crowded gym with a lot of noise, you don't have control of the humidity and the temperature, you don't have a coach screaming at you, you're trying to do what they did in the study, but you're not sure if you're doing it correctly, or even, if the study says that they're squatting, are you squatting into the same depth as they are in the study? In the study, they will often, make sure that you're doing it correctly. So you might not get the same results if you're doing things by yourself, even if you're trying to sort of imitate the study, because there are many things you can't control that are being controlled in the study. Even things like diet, in many studies, they even do like diet controls that they will, have people fill out forms. They will send meals with the participants. They will ask to get the remains back and weigh the remains to see how much they didn't eat. There's, and all these things, unless you're doing them, you have a coach who does this for you. The results might not be, perfectly transferable, so that's, I'm starting a bit, when I'm talking now, I'm a bit worried that, people will, when I talk about all the limitations, people will eventually think that, the studies will never apply to you. But that's not the case at all. It's just that you have to keep the limitations in mind when reading the studies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, it's tricky not to sound like super pessimistic with all these things, but I think it's like awareness is so important as well. And as we've mentioned, I think like there's definitely like some higher quality studies being done where they are thinking about these things a little bit more, and kind of ensuring for that. And it's that's just something so difficult to control for, in terms of like people cheating themselves in the gym and not kind of doing the form correctly. And I guess, I don't know, you might even know this, Adam, but I think there's even been studies on kind of having a coach train you for, it may have been done, like a coach train you through a program versus you just be given a program. Mm-hmm. And when a coach takes you through one, like you just, the results are better. I don't know if that's actually been studied or if I've made that up or if I've heard that somewhere and it's actually happened.
It's true. There's definitely studies on that. And there's one, it wasn't a coach, but it was like a diary program, like a digital diary where they secretly monitored participants. And they asked them, can you fill out this training diary every day? And can you open it and fill it out? And we want to make sure that you're using it every day. And they actually, interestingly, they found that, some people, a lot of people didn't open it because they had like an electronic sensor on the diary. And they found that a lot of people didn't actually open it at all, almost, even though they said they did. So it's kind of important that, things like adherence, are you adhering to what you're saying you're going to do, is so important, but it's so easy to, go by the wayside. And this is not just a limitation of studies, but also in your own training. A lot of people, even myself, you skip the training, but how often do you skip training? Like how is it like a routine that you skip training every other week, And as you probably know, Steve, once you start making a habit of skipping things, that it's very hard to sort of get back in and get to where you're supposed to be. So there's a lot of things to think about.
No, absolutely. And I guess in the same line of thought, in terms of like, it's almost that specificity type of thing in terms of what was the population studied, but also for training studies, particularly, like they might be just like measuring the biceps and not the rest of the body, yet someone might choose to now try and apply that somewhere else, or they might be training with this equipment and you've got this equipment, and how that might not necessarily transfer.
Yes. So in like the type of measurement is important. So if you like reading studies, you'll see that some studies, they measure muscle mass by DEXA. They estimate based on your, water status, and the body basically scans your body. The machine scans your body, and then you get like an estimate. Like, we think you have this many kilos or pounds of muscle, and this much water and this much fat mass and skeletal mass. So that's one way to measure muscle. There's also the cross-sectional area that I talked about that basically looks at a cross-section, also just one area or one sort of, I don't know how to explain better. I assume people understand when I say cross-section, sort of understand what I mean if you kind of cut your muscle in half.
Yeah.
So then you get a very local result, at that cross-section, you can see the size, but can you generalize what you're seeing at that point you're measuring? So the type of hypertrophy you're measuring has a lot to say about what kind of evidence you'll find. We saw some studies that they found a difference in cross-sectional area, but they did not find a difference in total lean body mass, right? So, the type of measurement you're making is really important. Is it local? Is it general? What is it supposed to be? And if you get even if you get after a program, you get significant gains in your biceps, maybe you didn't in your quads, right? So, that which applies for one area of your body doesn't necessarily apply for the other parts of your body. And also, if you're measuring the wrong thing, if you're measuring something that you didn't get a statistical significant result, and you conclude that there is no difference, maybe if you measured at another site in your body, you would get a significant result. So, never assume that just because a study has or does not have a statistically significant result, that it could be different if they did a different measurement.
Is there a particular measurement you like for hypertrophy? Is there one you would say that's the kind of gold standard for you?
I don't think there is I would say DEXA, when you're controlling for water mass, is good. Because then, water mass can influence how much muscle mass you have, because muscles are to a large extent water. So if you're really dehydrated, your lean mass will go down, your muscles. It's interesting. Just go on a no carb diet. Just don't eat any carbs and don't drink much water. Well, I'm not recommending you do this, but hypothetically, if you measured your muscles, there's been studies on this. If you measured your muscles, your glycogen stores will deplete and you'll also be dehydrated. Your muscles will shrink in size. So you'll think, okay, wow, look how small my muscles are. But they're actually not small. It's just there's less water and glycogen in them. And that's what you see when you do glycogen infusion studies, where they fill your muscles with water and glycogen. The cross-sectional area of the muscle grows by 4 or 5%. So, that's another thing. The hydration of your muscles depends on how large they are. So I think most of us have probably experienced looking ourselves in a mirror and we're like, why do I look so small today? Well, it could be because you're either don't have enough glycogen or you're dehydrated or there's, something else.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a good point to say that that if they don't include water, it's just that data is so then hard to trust. Any bodybuilders listening will know exactly that feeling of being completely flat on a diet and then you have a refeed day and then the next day you're like, oh yeah, things are popping now. So I completely relate to that point, and it makes a tremendous difference. I mean, that's why bodybuilders do the peaking, and you have the kind of cyclist studies with the depletion supercompensation. So if they don't take that into account, it just makes it so hard to know actually what's been going on. You're just like, okay, I don't know what to conclude here because we don't know what the water's doing. So that's a really good point. And then I know you had one on, and people always like to kind of talk about this. I think this is probably maybe more in the context of nutrition that people like to talk about it, is funding bias. I know you said you had kind of reasons why it isn't an issue, but why it could be as well. So I think the listeners would appreciate kind of having both sides of the argument. Yeah.
So this one is a really hot topic. I feel like there's a lot of emotions involved whenever you talk about funding bias. And if you go to Reddit or any forum, and if the funding source is stated in the study, which it should be, and people mention the funding, then a lot of people are going to be like, well, damn, this whole thing is biased. We can't just reject the entire study because one of the researchers went to seminar sponsored by some the industry. Therefore, all the research is forever should be rejected. I'm like, oh my God, please, like, come on, critical thinking here. Maybe funding bias could be an issue, but it doesn't have to be. So, for example, when is funding an issue? I think the funding of a scientist is an issue when he or she receives a lot of funding from like some industry sponsor who has many products that the researcher has scientific studies on maybe that product. They're actually there's a conflict of interest here. They're looking at a very particular product, and they're getting money, a lot of money maybe, for that, researching that product, and only coming up with good results for that product. Then my eyebrows are starting to raise a little bit, because that's a bit risky, but it doesn't automatically invalidate the study. But I think you should be extra careful there. And especially if the author also has books, the scientist also has books and products himself, that he's like selling, that's like only positive. He's like never critical about the projects or about the program or whatever it is. Always all the science supports it. There's only positive findings, and he's never critical. There's never like a limitation section in the studies and so on. Then, I would say the risk of bias is, the conflict of interest is a problem. But a lot of scientists also, they get funding in the sense that, let's say the university pays for a third of the study. The industry is also interested in the results, so the industry pays a third, and maybe some other organization that's unrelated pays a third. So is the study now biased because the industry has a third funding in the study? A lot of these studies are very controlled in the sense that nobody except the researchers get a hand in the design or the results or the interpretation before everything is published. Like they can't influence it. Which means that the researchers get money from the industry, but they're still independent in their work. So in that sense, I'm not covering. There's still a lot of different points to cover here, but there are definitely many situations where if the methodology of the study is strong and all the funding biases the funding sources are stated in the study, that's actually a good thing. That's not a bad thing. It's worse if they're hiding the funding, when it's not stated in the funding sources, then it's a problem. So there's also a lot of research, they've tested statistically, if a study is coming from a scientist who has got funding from the industry, is the result likely to be positive or negative? And in some cases, they find that yes, especially pharmaceutical industry, they find that a lot of studies are positive if they're funded by the industry. But in other studies, they've not found sort of bias. They've said, the studies are likely to be positive or negative for the things being tested, even if it's funded by the industry. So that's why what I'm saying, that you can't just like look at just the funding and just based on that one fact conclude whether the study is biased or not. There's like so much nuance.
Yeah, I guess if it's kind of one of those, I think, would I be right in saying that in your opinion, most of the time the funding isn't an issue, and it's kind of rare that it's like quite, and maybe it's normally quite clear that it's like this person is like, they're trying to sell their snake oil, and this is the snake oil company funding this guy or girl, and that. Do you feel like it's more that way?
I don't know. I simply don't know. Okay. Because I always like a data-based approach. So when you're asking me that question, the first thing I'm thinking is, do I have data to make an informed decision here? So the closest thing is the studies that are looking at funding bias. And from what I can tell is that it depends on the industry. Some industries are more susceptible, supplements and pharmaceuticals are more susceptible to funding bias because of the nature of the industry. Other industries are less susceptible. So I wouldn't make a general blanket statement. I would just say, for the viewer or listener, use your critical thinking. Look at the study methodology, look at the history of the author, look at their funding sources, look at, do they have a lot of products in addition to the funding from the industry? Look at all these things together and try to make it like a big picture. And then from that you can make we did an analysis in this in Sci-Fit. We did an analysis of the ketogenic industry and the biases therein. And we found that some ketogenic researchers do have a lot of conflicts of interests, books, products, services, funding. Others do not. So it's not an easy question to answer, but use critical thinking, and then you're closer to the answer.
Yeah. No, I like that. And I know it just makes me think of this, just comes to mind with the mass research review. And I know when kind of there was a recent Bill Campbell's refeed kind of study came out, and I know Eric Helms, for example, has been like a big kind of, I would say, quite like a promoter of refeeds, and he uses them with his athletes with great success. And I'm pretty sure, and I wouldn't be surprised, this is just like Eric, he kind of stated his biases. So he was kind of like upfront when he was reviewing that study, is kind of like putting his, like when someone's doing that, not that this is directly applicable because he didn't do the study, but if someone's like outlining their bias at the get-go, kind of that helps you as well. But I think you even mentioned kind of as a consumer of research, this is sometimes a problem where you're not, I guess it's kind of like cherry picking, where you will have like your little bit of a bias towards viewing things more favorably or not favorably. I think that's really hard to prevent yourself doing as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think in my experience, anything in a study, the thing with a study is you can reject or accept a study. Like personally, it's very easy. Just if you want to reject a study, then either find a conflict of interest or a funding, and then you can reject it, or or just go to the limitation section and find the limitation, and then you can reject the study. If you want to accept the study, then ignore all the funding biases and the limitations, and just find copy a sentence from the abstract, and then you're good to go. So, it's very easy to reject or accept studies because that's why I love science, because the limitation section is sort of obligatory. You have a limitation section. It's not a bad thing that there's a limitation section. There's a funding section. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing that these things are there. It means that the scientists are transparent, and it also means that they are aware that the study has limitations. And if you can find a study without limitations and without a funding source, it doesn't mean that the study is perfect. It just means that these things are not disclosed.
And I think, you're painting a picture, I think, that's really kind of just, to me, very apparent as a practitioner who tries to be evidence-based and use this, where it's a little bit overwhelming, like, oh my gosh, like I can't quite understand all these limitations and things. But I think it's the great thing about the evidence-based industry is we kind of keep everyone in a way, not necessarily, I might be slightly part of that, but you're certainly part of that, where you keep everyone to a standard, where it's kind of like, if one of these guys, I don't know, like if Eric Helms started like promoting this like kind of bullshit study, people would just be like, what the fuck, Eric? Like you kind of can't do it. And Eric knows that isn't something he's going to do either, because he's kind of true to, and people like him and within the mass research review, within your articles and your website, these are the things you're expert in looking at research, going through everything and trying to give kind of the most objective, rational, evidence-based answer for it. So I just say that as some, like, listening to you, as I imagine a lot of the listeners are more so similar to me versus you, and like you're kind of in depth looking at it a lot and kind of going through these, whereas I'm kind of more so trying to pass out kind of what's the practical value of this? Who do I kind of, in a sense, trust? Not that I want to be ignorant to the various biases and things that could be going on. But thankfully, there are people who are doing, like yourself and like the Mass Research Review, Renaissance Periodization, where they're kind of trying to dissect it, and you all kind of keep one another to a standard, and you kind of can't get away with going down a certain like dogmatic route, or at least it becomes very apparent quite quickly, I think.
Yeah, I think also if I can sort of compliment, I really want to compliment your approach, because you're aware of these things, you're looking for them, you're actively sort of you found this article, and you're also been aware of this previously. I assume the different things that we talk about in the article, and from your podcast as well. I think you're very nuanced, which is awesome, and I think nuance is a big important piece here, because once you sort of go down that you can only do things one way, like one training approach or one method. I think it's good for marketing because then you can position yourself in the market. But in terms of like nuance, I think it's important that, there's a lot of individual variation. Some people respond well to the ketogenic diet. Some people respond well to fasting, intermittent fasting. Some people will respond well no matter what the diet is because they have amazing genetics. So I think that's also a very important point.
Hi guys, Steve here. Just wanted to take a moment of your time to remind you of our online coaching service. At Revive Stronger, we pride ourselves on providing personalized service that will take your physique and knowledge to the next level. If you're interested, check the description and sign up.
I appreciate that a lot. And I think what you said there is completely true in that regard. And it's people love black and white answers, and I guess that's why science is a bit scary to some people, because it's like it doesn't really give you a black and white answer. There's a few things we're very, very certain about, but it doesn't really give you answers. It kind of gives you more kind of rabbit holes to go down in future, and it gets you closer to a truth, but I don't think it ever kind of fully necessarily reveals that truth. But yeah, people like the black and white, that's easy to sell, and it's simpler. Like if there's bad foods, it's like just avoid these and your diet's perfect now. Whereas it's kind of nuanced, more complex, and people are like, bore off, like I don't want to hear about this. So it's trying to and keep your kind of yourself up to date. Like you said, like you might train a certain way that might seem like science and it might seem like it's providing results, but you might learn something new further down the line, and now you change what you're doing. And I think that's important as well. And I guess that's where the beauty of science comes in, where you get more and more data and research to kind of back up various arguments that can kind of point you in the right direction more so.
Yeah, definitely. It's always like, that's the process of science. You never stop. You just keep on going, and like you said, you keep on building on the knowledge that you have, which means that you might need to update your recommendations, guidelines, because things are always changing, which is, I think is cool, but it might be a bit, I assume people listening to this are thinking, well, I don't have time to keep up with 10 different fields in science, and but I think the best answer then would be just to follow Steve Hall, or follow Brian Schoenfeld, Stuart Phillips, Greg Knuckles. Follow these evidence-based fitness guys that are doing content on podcasts, on articles, and infographics. I think that's a very easy way to stay updated on the research without having to read like 10 studies every day.
And I wonder if you'd agree on this, Adam, but I think a lot of the kind of core principles of science and like your core training philosophies, your core diet philosophies, they're not going to suddenly the next day you're like, it seems calorie deficit doesn't work or something like this, where it's just like suddenly kind of flip-flops. It's more so just these small little changes, and they might build up to be a significant change at some point. But yeah, it's not like if someone doesn't keep up to date like every month or week or even year, probably not too much is probably even changing in a year for a lot of people.
Yeah, and to get into that, all the things that we're trying to optimize, that's like the forest for the trees. You can focus all your attention on like things like training frequency, how often you train, or you can focus on the exercise selection, and you can focus on, did you get 100 calories more or less today? All these things, while mentally satisfying, perhaps for many of us who like optimization, these are the things that matter less. The 20-80% principle, like 20%. It's like you can, by being adherent to the gym, having adherence, good sleep, and eating in a calorie deficit or a calorie surplus, depending on your goals, like the really basic fundamental things, and doing strength training, like these are the things that will get you the 80% of the progress. Whenever you start going beyond these things and looking into the small details, you can still eke out performance gains, which is really important if you're like a competitor or trying to get really, really fit, for a show. But it's not that super important for just having a good progress, so.
No, absolutely. I think that's very, very well said. I think, if anything felt overwhelming, now you can feel a little bit less overwhelmed, and like rest assured, just focus on your big rocks there. One of the ones I did want to cover, because I think it's probably another one that's maybe a little bit contentious in some ways, is kind of animal studies and kind of what impact that would have.
Yes, so animal studies is in my, like, I really like them, but I dislike how they're being used, because they are often abused in the sense that, first of all, researchers won't state in the abstract that this is an animal study, even though in my experience, or in my opinion, it should be in the title, like rat study or rodent study, because animal studies that are done do not transfer to humans. It should be, I feel like it should be very obvious. There's actually research looking at the differences in humans and animals, and how when they can and can't be transferable. Some things are more transferable than others, but you can't do a study on 20 rats and say that, look, the rats, we forced the rats to do like 20 reps on their front limb, which would be like the bicep of the human or whatever, and then assume that the training program of the rats is going to apply to us. It's just like exploratory. They're exploratory. You try it on the animals, and then you can maybe, if it's ethically acceptable, you can do it on humans as well. But it's an issue. Animal studies do not transfer to humans, and I feel like too often on forums they are. People discuss the rats as if they are humans, and it sounds kind of silly, but I think it's important to be sure, read carefully who are the subjects. If this abstract doesn't state that the subjects are human, what are they? Are they? It's important. It's important who the subjects are in the study.
Yeah, I know an example that always comes to my mind is, I think it's like aspartame, and how like people are like, oh, like it's very likely to cause cancer, and it's caused cancer, and look at all these studies, and it's like the kind of quantity to body mass of aspartame the rats were having was just like absurd. And this is, I guess, for the listeners, like, just when you see something that just sounds like completely counter to most of what's been talked about in the evidence-based sphere, just kind of go and check it out. But it's scary that it's not in the abstract, and it doesn't need to be there, because I think, you've just described exactly why you shouldn't just read the abstract.
Yeah, if people are like interested in, like, some people might be asking, well, what's the difference? What's the difference? So I would actually look at, an example is go to Google and write in AMPK expression, human rodent, and then AMPK is basically, it's one of the things in the muscle or cells that determines whether the cells will grow or shrink in muscles, for example. How energy is being used. It's related to mTOR and the growth, which mTOR is another thing that's being maybe abused a lot, because it's like a mechanism within cells that is often used to try to predict gains in muscle, but it's often not that easy or simple, because I think cancer affects mTOR as well. So this is very, I'll try not to get into like the technical things here, but there's many things you can look at in animals and humans that are different.
So I guess, I know you said you like animal studies as like I guess like you said, an exploratory, like an interest, but you wouldn't be drawing conclusions and applying that to humans. And I think you mentioned there's some potentially, depending on what they're studying, there's some more applicable ways to use them. And they like, there might be like, I don't know, if you're studying this and using animals, don't look at it particularly strongly. But if you're doing this, maybe that's a little bit more similar to how a human would react in that situation. Is that what do you have any examples of that?
I can't come up with any. Well, I know animals there's one good use. They're used sometimes to test, like you said, with aspartame, even though it's not a perfectly good transfer. You can use animals, I believe, to test if there's like a new substance or drug or something, you can test it on animals and see how they react. And if they have a high tolerance for it, there's a reasonable chance that humans will also have a high tolerance, even though you can't draw the distinction directly. It's like they're often used for safety tests. Like if a new drug kills the rats immediately, even at very, very small doses, then you won't even test it on humans because there is.
I got you.
So there are definitely a lot of good uses there. Yeah.
I know one of the ones, just because I'm currently, not that I'm wearing it now, doing a bit of a weighted vest kind of experiment. And I know that for some of the gravitostat kind of studies where it's shown that it might be an independent kind of predictor of like appetite that's outside of leptin with the weight on the kind of bones and the osteocytes. It's just completely that's rodent based. Like there's no human studies. I have no idea if that's at all particularly applicable. Like you said, it's probably just more exploratory, and I wouldn't be being like everyone in their fat loss phases wear your weighted vests because you're guaranteed this result. It's more like maybe just like if it's kind of a fun thing for you and it suits your lifestyle, you could try it out. But it's a rodent study, and there's not much.
Yeah, and you mentioned things like leptin, like hormones, like leptin. They're different. They're different in animals and humans, and even though some aspects of them are similar, they're different enough that even the difference between humans in hormones can be big, and these differences are even bigger between different species. So it's like you said, it's kind of fun when they do like weighted vests on animals, and just it's kind of interesting. But I would never directly apply to humans. Personally, I need at least to have like a strong conclusion about anything. I prefer to have at least 3 randomized controlled trials in humans that are like of good quality with enough subjects. That's generally, I would say, that's a standard that can't always be filled, but once you have enough studies in humans, then you can be generally safe that something is going to work.
Yeah, and I guess, like you said there, that's a really nice little kind of ballpark for people. And would you generally say, looking at like meta-analyses, systematic reviews for people who are interested in using science, but kind of are not wanting to dig into individual studies, would you say they're a good kind of starting point to draw maybe some conclusions from?
I think you would. Looking at reviews and meta-analyses is much better than single studies, because if the author has done a good job, then they will give you a good summary. But again, then the risk is that if you need to know how to read a review because the authors make mistakes, we've looked at a lot of reviews in Sci-Fit, and we found that oftentimes, or not often, but it happens that authors maybe misinterpret the studies, and then the review is also flawed as a result. So I would still make the recommendation for, unless you're like really interested in science, I would still instead follow your podcast and your content, because then you get the summaries from the topics, from the, like, for example, you had Mike Israetel, you've had him on, and it's so much easier to just listen to a podcast or follow some of the biggest names in the industry, or read their articles. Much better than trying to read and understand the review, unless you have scientific training or want to get scientific training. Then I would say you can start reading reviews and studies.
Yeah. No, I think that's well said. It's something I'm, again, like I said, I'm a practitioner, and I feel like that's where I should be spending most of my time. If I tried, it's a full-time commitment trying to do like what you're doing in terms of like running through these things. And also, like you mentioned, if you're not trained to do it, you're going to really struggle to, not that people should necessarily completely be away from it, but at least you understand now, if, like you said, if someone like Mike Israetel is saying this study is not necessarily as powerful as what, if you read it, it might be. Now you understand why, maybe some of the reasons we've included in here too is why. So I want to make sure people kind of know where they can, I guess your website is where they can reach out to you. Thank you so much for this. I think it's been really, really excellent. And I think people hopefully have taken a lot away from it and have just a better understanding of kind of science and how it works, and how, if they want to kind of dig into it a bit more, what they can do. If they want to learn more about you, Adam, where should they go? And have you got any exciting kind of future directions or anything you want to talk about out, you can also do that now.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I want to say first, it's a great honor to be on this podcast, and I know this podcast has been going on for a long time, and I used to watch it. Many of the episodes I watched previously, so it's really great honor to be here. And if you want to follow me, it's on sci-fit.net, which stands for the Science of Fitness. And there we review various topics, and we can spend half a year on an article just to review it properly. So right now we're doing a review on sleep, how sleep affects fat loss, and
Amazing.
And it's kind of cool because we looked at this previously, and there aren't a lot of science-based articles on this topic. So we were like, okay, cool, we'll do one. And it's kind of cool. Just a small spoiler: if you have very poor sleep, then it can actually hinder your progress. So it just goes to the importance of sleep in terms of things like fat loss. I didn't necessarily think that poor sleep would give you slower fat loss, but it might. So on the site, we do a lot of reviews that are practically focused. We always try to find out what can you do differently in your diet and or training program to have a good progress. So we try to simplify the science as much as possible. Yeah.
I know there was recently one on, I think it was failure training. That was one done, and that was very, like you said, I mean, some of these things take you a long time, like half a year. I'm not surprised because it was very in depth, and the audience, as well as myself, very interested in sleep. Talk about it quite a lot on the podcast. So that is one I'll definitely be keeping an eye out for. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on, Adam. I'll make sure that your website is linked below so people can go check that out. And yeah, take care, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. See you guys.
So I'm Steve Hall, founder of Revive Stronger and a coach of Revive Stronger.
My name is Pascal Flor. I'm the co-owner of Revive Stronger and also a coach, of course.
Revive Stronger has probably been going solidly for 3 years, roughly about 3 years.
Revive Stronger, to me, it is becoming kind of my child, my foster child. It's the gathering and getting together of like-minded people.
We've been expanding the coaching team, which is helping us help more people, but each coach can only help a certain number of people.
Right now, it's all over the place. We have YouTube, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, but there isn't that community aspect behind that.
And so the next step for us is developing a membership site.
So basically, we want to create a family and a community that is then benefiting from another.
A really cool community for people within our little niche is going to be a website.
They will get early access to our podcast.
You can access us, ask us questions.
The community aspect, we have a forum there. You can ask questions, but also you can log your journey.
There's also going to be courses on there.
Courses, presentations on different topics. Discount of past seminar footage. We will log our journey as well. We'll start vlogging.
We're going to have documentaries.
Our entire athletic journey. Furthermore, they get access to an exercise video library.
The exercises that we love for hypertrophy and maximizing hypertrophy, we're going to go through those in depth, telling you how to execute them.
We kept them concise and also mobile friendly so that you can watch them in between your sets.
I'm super excited to grow this community. The amount of value that we're going to be delivering is huge. And I'd love you to be part of it.
You will get so much out of that.
I'll see you inside.